My parents worshipped my brother all their lives, but after he bankrupted them and vanished, they came begging to the failure they always ignored. For as long as I can remember, everything in my house revolved around my brother. It did not matter what I did, if I got good grades, if I cleaned the kitchen without being asked, if I spent hours in my room studying so as not to bother, nothing seemed to be worth it because there was always someone better, someone who breathed and automatically deserved more. My brother was not only the favorite, he was my parents' life project, their emotional investment, their standard-bearer in front of the family, the one who, according to them, had a star since he was born. Instead, I was labeled early on as the one who did not shine, the one who would always need help, the one who, if he was saved from falling lower, it was a miracle. And although it hurt me, because of course it hurt me, I learned to bear it. Not because I did not care, but because at some point I understood that wearing yourself out trying to prove your worth in a place where they have already decided you do not have it is like trying to fill a broken bucket. You can empty yourself completely, but it will never be enough. My brother, meanwhile, floated through life. It is not that he was a genius, or particularly hardworking, or a good person. In fact, he was quite the opposite. Manipulative, a liar, an opportunist, but he had a skill that I never had. He knew how to appear successful even when he was not. He knew how to dress, talk, move. He said empty phrases that sounded profound, and my parents thought he was the greatest. I remember once he came home saying he was in the process of starting a business, that he had met some guys at a conference who were willing to invest in his idea, and, although he did not even have a presentation made, my mother lent him part of her savings, and my father co-signed a loan for him. Me, on the other hand, they scolded if I asked for money for the bus. I do not want this to be understood as just a childish tantrum. Years passed, years in which I had to watch how each of my brother's failures was turned into learning, while my efforts were ignored. If he lost money, it was part of the natural risk of growth. If I had an economic setback, it was because I did not know how to organize myself. If he treated my mom badly, it was because he was stressed about his future. If I said a word louder than normal, they looked at me as if I had disappointed them again. And yet, there I was. Not for them, but because I understood that I should not live waiting for their approval. I started working, educating myself, looking for my own spaces, building a life with the little I had. I did it at my own pace and without saying anything. I was never one to brag or go around telling my achievements because in this house I learned that telling your progress is giving others excuses to tell you that they are not worth as much as you think. But the breaking point came when the family business, a small trading company that my father had founded years ago, began to collapse. My brother, as always, neck deep in decisions he did not understand, had convinced my dad to risk capital to invest in a supposed expansion that never existed. According to him, they were going to sign an agreement with a foreign chain, but the only thing he managed to do was to indebt the company beyond what it could sustain. I found out from outside sources, because at home nobody told me anything. In fact, when I tried to ask, my mother simply told me not to worry, that those things were not at my level. That was the exact phrase, and I swear it stayed with me like a splinter under my skin. In a matter of months, everything fell apart. The company went bankrupt, the house was foreclosed, and my father ended up facing a lawsuit for non-payment. My mother, who had always been accustomed to a comfortable lifestyle, did not understand how it was possible that her star son had caused so much disaster. But even then, when the water was up to their necks, they continued to believe that he was going to get them out of it. He is busy looking for solutions, my mom would say, as if every silence from my brother was part of a great master plan. But that plan never came. Not a call, not a visit, not a WhatsApp message. Nothing. He blocked them all. He evaporated as if the family did not exist. And then, as a last resort, they knocked on my door. I remember that night perfectly. It was almost 9 when I heard the doorbell. When I opened it, I found my parents standing in front of the door, carrying 2 worn-out suitcases and a look that I could not immediately interpret. There was shame, yes, but also a kind of blind resignation, as if they finally accepted that they had no other option than to turn to the one they always considered Plan B. There were no long speeches, just my father muttering, "We have nowhere to go. You are all we have left." That phrase, spoken with a broken voice and without the slightest arrogance he had maintained for years, hit me harder than I imagined. But I said nothing. I asked no questions. I just opened the door and let them in. What my parents did not know, and perhaps still do not fully understand, is that that moment was the beginning of something much bigger. Because yes, I received them, I offered them shelter, food, calm, but silently I began to build what would be the greatest lesson I would give them in their lives. Not out of empty revenge, but because I understood that the only way to repair the damage was not with late apologies, but with a dose of reality, because the failure they always looked down on, this time, was going to be the one to put them in front of the mirror, cracks and all. Update 1. 3 months had already passed since that night when my parents first crossed the threshold of my apartment, the one that for years they had felt was too humble to visit, and that had now become their only refuge. At first, the atmosphere was tense, silent, almost uncomfortable. It was noticeable that they did not know how to behave in a house that did not belong to them, much less in one where the failed son was the one dictating the rules. My mother did not say much. She spent most of her time in the kitchen, as if taking care of the food was a way to compensate for everything that had broken between us. My father, on the other hand, spent hours reviewing old papers, reading contracts that were no longer valid, making calls that no one answered. I saw him crumble little by little, although he would never admit it out loud. It was the first time I had seen him truly small, as if ruin had not only emptied his pockets, but also his dignity. During that time, I made no reproaches. I did not rub it in their faces. I did not remind them of what they had said about me or how much it cost me to get back on my feet. I just helped. I got them a decent mattress. I offered them my meal times. I organized my routines so as not to invade their space or make them feel even more vulnerable. It was as if all the resentment had frozen, and now I was observing it from a display case, knowing that sooner or later it would melt again. But that wait was not passive. While I gave them shelter and silence, I began to observe, to understand how my brother moved, what he was doing, where he had gotten to, because although for them he had disappeared, I knew that a guy like him does not disappear. He hides behind a new mask. Through a work contact, a friend who manages databases of emerging investors, I found out that my brother had launched a new technological proposal. He called it that, with bombastic words like financial disruption and decentralized blockchain solutions. All smoke, all packaging. I knew him too well. He had built a facade of success, pretending to be in the middle of investment rounds, sharing screenshots of meetings with supposed businessmen who were actually freelancers hired for a photo session. But the most interesting thing of all was discovering that he was desperate for money, very desperate. He was convinced that his personal brand still had weight, and that is why he was looking for investors who did not know his history. That is where the spark ignited. I did not know if my parents still believed in him, but I suspected they did. There was something in their eyes, in the way they avoided talking about him, that made it clear to me that they had not completely let go of him. So I did not tell them anything, not a word about what I had found out. I kept it all to myself and started to act. I used a fake name and a different address to contact my brother's company. I pretended to be a middle-aged businessman interested in investing in emerging technology projects. I contacted him on LinkedIn, making him believe I was based in another city, and, from the first response, I knew he would fall for it easily. It did not take long for him to send me his pitch, a PDF full of inflated figures and absurd projections that spoke of millions of users in the first year. I laughed while reading it. It was a play. During the following weeks, I maintained contact. I asked him questions. I feigned interest. I asked him for specific data, and he, believing himself smarter than he was, responded quickly, convinced that he had finally found the investor he needed to build his empire. He even offered me a preferential investment, which was basically his way of begging for money with elegant words. I asked him for a call, but I pretended that my accent did not match my photo, so I told him that I had a trusted partner who would help me with the legal part and that he would be the one to sign the agreement. There was never such a partner, of course, but I managed to create a fake structure credible enough for him to sign documents and share part of his internal strategy with me. While I was doing all this, at home the dynamic with my parents had changed a bit. They were starting to trust me, to ask me things, to ask me for help with paperwork. My mother told me one afternoon, while we were having coffee, that she never thought I would be the one to be there when everything fell apart. She did not say it as an apology, not even as a thank you. It was more of an uncomfortable acknowledgement. as if it was hard for her to process that the one she once saw as a lost cause was now her only option. I just nodded without saying anything, because I had already begun to understand that true answers are not given with words, but with actions. My brother continued to feed his charade without knowing that one of his allies was me. He sent me updates about his company. He talked to me about his supposed international expansion, about the deals he was closing. All smoke, all fantasy. And while he was building his house of cards, I made sure I had all the strings in my hand, waiting for the right moment to blow hard and make it all come crashing down. Because this time, if he was going to fall, he would do it with noise, and my parents, who always saw in him a light that never existed, were going to witness how it went out abruptly. Update 2. Another 6 months passed, and by that point, I had more information than I ever imagined about my brother's movements. I knew who he was talking to, what kind of investors were circling him, how much he really owed, and most importantly, I knew the exact level of his desperation. It was not just an inflated project to attract naive investors. It was a time bomb he himself had built without having the slightest idea how to defuse it. He was indebted to entities not exactly known for their patience. And to maintain his genius entrepreneur status with acquaintances and social media, he had mortgaged a couple of assets that were not even in his name. In other words, he stole without being called a thief. He lied without being directly accused. And yet, he paraded around as if his success story were legitimate. Meanwhile, at home, the situation with my parents had taken a direction that at times I found hard to process. They had started to rebuild their lives from scratch. And although they still carried many of the condescending attitudes of the past, it was also evident that they no longer had the same energy to impose their criteria. They were tired, emotionally drained. My mother, little by little, stopped talking about her golden son as if he were a misunderstood victim and began to focus more on the little things. Preparing food for everyone, watering the plants, cleaning every corner as if that would give her back some of the control she had lost. My father enrolled in an online basic administration course, one of those free ones that do not offer important degrees, but kept him busy. There were days when I heard him repeating accounting terms in a low voice, as if trying to finally understand what he did not know how to manage when he had a company in his hands. On one of those ordinary days, while my mother was washing dishes and my father was reading a course report, we received an invitation that in another context would have seemed like a family achievement. My brother publicly announced the inauguration of his new operational headquarters and the celebration of his first year of success as CEO of his own startup. The invitation arrived via a group email that even included cousins, uncles, old schoolmates, and yes, my parents too. I was not mentioned, of course. To him, I was still a secondary figure, the brother who is ignored until he becomes useful. The event was at an elegant restaurant in the city center, one of those places where each appetizer costs what I earn in half a work shift, and of course, my parents decided to go. I said nothing. I did not try to stop them. I did not warn them what I knew, nor did I hint at what I was preparing. I let them go as if nothing. I helped them choose appropriate clothes for the event. I even accompanied them to the taxi. I saw my mother adjusting her necklace in front of the mirror, the one she had kept in a box for years because she said it was only worn for special occasions. I heard my father practicing what he was going to say if someone asked him how they were. It was evident that both believed that night would mark a kind of silent reconciliation, a moment when everything they had experienced would become an anecdote, and when their successful son would recognize them again as part of his world. Fools. That night I did not go to the restaurant, but I had eyes there. A friend of mine who works as a permanent waiter at the place sent me photos, details, and even excerpts of conversations. Everything had been carefully staged to feed my brother's image of greatness. He had hired actors to pose as partners, decorated the tables with folders full of empty documents, and organized a presentation where he spoke of inflated figures and projections that only existed in his head. But the lowest, most miserable thing of all was what he did to my parents. He assigned them a table at the back of the room, right next to the bathroom. It was not an exaggeration. He put them far from the stage, far from the other important guests. According to my friend, my mother tried to get up to greet him when he passed by the front, but one of the assistants stopped her, saying that there would be time for family greetings later. My father was offered cheap whiskey, while the rest were served glasses of French wine. None of the supposed partners spoke to them, and my brother, throughout the entire event, only approached their table once and said, quickly and almost automatically, that he was busy but happy they could attend. That night my parents returned in silence. My mother took off her earrings as soon as she crossed the door, put them in a small box, and never mentioned them again. My father went straight to the bathroom and stayed there for almost an hour. They did not cry in front of me. They did not complain. They did not utter my brother's name. But the disappointment was so evident it was palpable. I did not say anything either. I just served them some tea and sat in the kitchen as if we were just roommates sharing an ordinary night. What my parents did not know, and neither did my brother, was that while they thought they were in the middle of a gala dinner, I had already sent the first packages of documents to several financial journalists, attaching proof that my brother's company had no legal backing, that his initial investment came from disguised personal accounts, and that he had manipulated his reports to attract fraudulent capital. The same documents that he, in his arrogance, had shared with me without suspecting he was feeding his own downfall. Because while he sought to shine in front of everyone, I was just waiting for the right moment to turn off his light, and that moment was getting closer and closer. Update 3. A little over a year had passed since my parents moved into my apartment, and since my brother organized that grotesque play he dared to call a business celebration. In that time, every piece I had silently moved began to fall into place with a precision that, honestly, not even I had anticipated. I had built the scaffolding of his downfall with such patience and detail that it was no longer a question of if it would collapse, but simply of when. And the when came sooner than I expected. On a Tuesday morning, while I was making myself a coffee without thinking about anything in particular, my cell phone vibrated with a notification from one of the financial websites I usually follow. I did not need to read the full title to know what it was about. My brother's name was written in large letters, accompanied by the word scam right next to it. I opened the note and confirmed what I already knew. An investigative journalist to whom I had given all the documents, emails, and false presentations weeks before had published a complete report exposing how my brother had used false identities, empty promises, and manipulated documents to attract supposed investors and simulate a financing round that never existed. The article was backed by screenshots, bank records, contracts signed between him and representatives of investment funds that turned out to be himself using different names, and, most seriously, there was clear evidence of money laundering using accounts linked to a fictitious company registered under the name of a woman who never existed. The story exploded in a matter of hours. It became a trend on several platforms. Comments soon appeared, and what impressed me most was the speed with which the narrative changed. Those who previously applauded him and held him up as an example of young visionaries began to say that they always suspected there was something strange, that his success was too good to be true, that something smelled fishy from the beginning. They left him alone, absolutely alone. His public image, carefully made up for years, collapsed with the force of an avalanche. And I was there, in the front row, watching everything fall apart. That same day he was called to testify. The company was placed under formal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. His accounts were frozen, his website was shut down, and his operating permit was suspended. In short, it was over. He tried to make a public statement, a poorly recorded video from a dark corner of his apartment where he tried to explain that everything was a media confusion and that the numbers were being misinterpreted. It was pathetic. He looked like a smoke salesman trying to convince someone that the fire was just steam. Nobody believed him. Even some of the supposed employees he had hired for his events, the actors and freelancers I had identified from the beginning, began to tell how everything was a setup, how he paid them in cash, how they received scripts with what they should say if someone asked about their roles in the company. My parents found out about the scandal that same night. My father was coming home from the supermarket with a bag in his hand when he saw his face on television. The volume was low, but the image said it all. He froze. The bag slowly slipped from his fingers, and the apples rolled across the floor without him making the slightest attempt to pick them up. My mother came out of the room when she heard the thud and saw the screen with wide eyes, as if she could not understand what she was seeing. They said nothing, not a word. The silence that filled the room was more eloquent than any shout. I did not speak either. I just bent down, picked up the apples, and put them back in the bag. The rest of the night was a parade of sighs, ragged breaths, and empty stares. The following days were a parade of consequences for him. Some investors initiated legal proceedings for fraud, others, more cowardly, simply disappeared from the map. His landlord canceled his contract and evicted him from the apartment where he lived, as he was also implicated in the use of a false address to register the company. He was summoned by the prosecutor's office and, although his immediate arrest was not ordered, a series of precautionary measures were imposed on him, including a ban on leaving the country, the freezing of his assets, and the obligation to pay initial compensation to cover part of the damages. He had nothing. He had spent everything, absolutely everything, on business cards, on empty marketing, on luxury dinners to impress those he thought would one day save him. A week later, the message I knew would sooner or later appear arrived. A number I did not have registered, but which I recognized immediately by the way it was written. He sent me a long paragraph, full of excuses disguised as sincerity. It said something like he knew he had made a mistake, but that he had done everything under pressure, that he needed time to explain himself, that he knew things between us were not perfect, but that now more than ever he needed his family. I did not reply. I left him on read for hours, until at night, while I was sitting in the dining room watching my parents silently play a game of dominoes, I took my cell phone and wrote a single sentence. Sometimes what one needs is not family, but memory. After that, he did not insist again. I suppose he understood that he no longer had any cards to play. My parents did not mention the subject either. They did not defend him. They did not justify him. I think they finally understood, maybe not everything. Maybe they will never have the humility to recognize what they did to me for years. But that night, when my mother served me coffee without saying anything and my father offered me a broken cookie while patting me on the back, I knew that something had broken forever, and that, for the first time, that something was not me. Update 4. A little over 2 years had passed since my parents came to live with me. And although at first it was an emotional chaos disguised as routine, over time the dynamic between us changed in a way I would never have imagined. It was not about reconciliation or explicit forgiveness, but about a coexistence where silence, finally, made room for truth. There was no longer that clumsy need to pretend that everything was fine, nor those passive-aggressive comments that used to sneak into conversations. Little by little, they began to treat me as an equal, although it was noticeable that they still did not quite know how to do it without their pride trembling a little. And I was not looking for redemption anymore either, because by then the only validation that mattered to me was the one that came from the simple fact of looking back and knowing that, without anyone else, I had managed to build something solid, stable, and dignified. During that time, I took advantage of my brother's public downfall to continue working on what really interested me. I was able to leave one of my 2 jobs thanks to a small raise in the other, and with that, I started saving more consistently. I also took some online courses, nothing ostentatious, but enough to update my profile and improve my income. I even started collaborating with a financial advisory firm for people in bankruptcy, a delicious irony considering that part of my job was to analyze fraud cases like the one I had dismantled in my own family. My parents, for their part, began to collaborate with a neighborhood parish, organizing events and donations, and although they did not talk much about what they had lost, I noticed that somehow they were beginning to reconcile with their own reality, one that no longer included their star sun shining brightly. My brother, meanwhile, faced a legal storm that was just beginning to gain strength. The prosecutor's office had initiated proceedings for aggravated fraud, use of false documents, and simulation of legal acts. I was not a formal part of the case as a complainant, but I was a protected witness under a legal name that I had processed with the advice of the company where I worked. The lawyers handling the prosecution contacted me to provide the data I had collected as the fake investor, and after reviewing all the evidence I gave them, they asked me to make a sworn written statement detailing the mechanisms he used to commit fraud. It was there that I decided to take the final step. I met with an independent lawyer, and with his help, we prepared a report that included not only the evidence they already knew, but also a part that until that moment I had kept reserved, the origin of the capital he used for his company. What my parents did not know, or perhaps they did but denied it internally, was that part of the money my brother had used as seed investment came from my mother's savings, which he had convinced her to transfer with the excuse of rebuilding the family business, just before the company went bankrupt. Not only did he not return the money, but he registered it as his own capital in his reports, completely hiding the origin and leaving my parents as collateral victims of his ambition. That information was key. The judge used it to justify the demand for economic restitution in favor of my parents, who were recognized as directly affected, although at that time they had absolutely nothing to recover in terms of material assets. The fact that the law backed them meant something important, at least symbolically. My mother cried silently upon receiving the official notification, and although she never asked me how all that had come to light, she simply said one night, while passing me a cup of tea, that things always fall under their own weight in the end. It was the closest thing to a thank you I received, and it was enough. With part of the compensation the judge ordered him to pay, and knowing they would never receive it in full because he no longer had the means to respond, I decided to do something I had been planning for a long time. I bought a small country house in a town an hour from the city, nothing luxurious, but with a large patio, a comfortable kitchen, and a view that took your breath away in the afternoons. It became our weekend refuge. On Sundays, after lunch, my mother used to sit under a tree to read, while my father fixed things that did not need fixing just to feel that he still had a function. I cooked, worked from the porch, or simply watched them in silence, thinking about everything that had happened. It was an overwhelming contrast if one remembered what our relationship was like just 3 years before. My brother, on the other hand, had spent a month in preventive detention after breaching one of the conditions of the process. He could not approach his victims, but in a clumsy attempt to regain sympathy, he showed up at the church where my parents collaborated, which was considered a direct violation of the precautionary measures. He was released on bail only because one of his last contacts managed to pull some strings, but he no longer had social or economic support. I saw him once, by accident, walking through the city center with his face covered by a cap and sunken eyes, as if he could not bear for people to recognize him. And no, I did not feel sorry for him, not one bit, because if I understood anything in this whole process, it is that there are people who, even if they drown in their own ego, never learn until they hit rock bottom with their face. The circle was not completely closed yet, but every day I felt that the air was cleaner, fairer. I had managed to make my parents see clearly. I had put the truth of an imposter before the world, and I had done it without shouting, without clumsy revenge, without violence. I had done it with data, with strategy, with the same coldness with which they had ignored me for years. And now, without looking for it, I was the one who held the keys, not only to the house, but to the entire family narrative. Final update. More than 3 years had passed since that night my parents knocked on my door with suitcases in hand. Dragging more than just their physical luggage, they carried the weight of all the wrong decisions of an entire life dedicated to an illusion called perfect son, and to the silent condemnation of the other, the son who was never enough. Since then, much had changed. The country house we bought with part of the compensation, the one that ironically came from the collapse of the same son they once believed to be a savior, became our new center. We no longer lived together in the small apartment where it all began. My parents decided to move permanently to that place surrounded by trees where life passed slowly, without so much noise, without so many false faces, without so much drama. And I, for my part, returned to my complete independence in the city, although we continued to see each other every weekend, with the naturalness that time gives when resentment no longer has the strength to govern every encounter. My work had evolved. I got a better position at the firm where I collaborated, and although I was never one for luxuries or applause, I allowed myself small pleasures that were previously only distant fantasies. A good computer, a short trip every now and then, a library I always wanted to have, and above all, the freedom not to depend on anyone. I also started giving talks at local universities on business crisis management and corporate fraud prevention. Every time I entered a room to talk about those topics, there was a moment when my mind returned, even if only for a second, to the image of my brother with his plastic smile, selling smoke to those who wanted to believe him. And that contrast pushed me to continue, because justice does not always come in the form of jail or scandal. Sometimes it presents itself like this, with a firm voice in front of an attentive audience, telling the truth without trembling. My brother, on the other hand, no longer had the disguise or the energy to continue pretending. After the legal process and the time he spent in preventive detention, His reputation was so damaged that no bank, no firm, no serious entity wanted him near. He tried to reinvent himself several times, even using new aliases on the internet, creating accounts where he sold consulting services to entrepreneurs. But people recognized him. They reported him. They blocked him. He was trapped in the same labyrinth of lies that he built, with every exit closed by his own hands. There was a time when he slept in rooms rented by the night, sold things that were not his, and used the excuse it was all a plot against me to justify his ruin. Even so, he never apologized, never sent a message admitting guilt. The closest thing was a call he tried to make to the country house, which my father rejected with the same coldness with which he had once treated me when I told him I needed help to pay for university. The last time I heard from him was through an email. It had no subject, no signature, but the address was his. The message read verbatim, "I know you hate me, but they still see you as their second option. Do not fool yourself." I read it calmly, taking the time to analyze each word, not for what it said, but for what it revealed, that he was still trapped in that idea of competition, of favoritism, of absurd family hierarchies that only live in the mind of someone who was never capable of loving unconditionally. I deleted it without replying, because I no longer cared what he believed or what he tried to sow, because by then, I had already won something that neither all his theatrics, nor all his money, nor all his rehearsed speeches could achieve: the peace that comes from not owing anything to anyone. That same weekend, at the country house, after lunch, my mother asked me to accompany her to look through some boxes she had stored in the attic. I did not quite know what she was looking for, but I followed her without saying much. Among the old objects, wrinkled papers, and photo albums, she found a notebook. It was hers from many years ago. She opened it and read a page in a low voice. Then she looked at me and said, "It said here that you were the one we worried about the least because we knew that sooner or later you would get back on your feet on your own. But we never told you, and I am sorry for that." I stared at her. I did not know what to reply. I did not expect it, and although that sentence did not erase what had happened, it did bring closure. A real one that did not sound like an excuse or cheap comfort. That night, as the sun set and the lights of the town lit up in the distance, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and listened to my parents talking softly to each other, laughing at some anecdote I no longer remember. And there, right at that moment, I understood that my revenge had not been to destroy my brother. He did that to himself. My revenge was to stay, to resist, to grow, to return the blow with facts, with dignity, with silence. It was to make them themselves, without me demanding it, see the sun they had refused to look at for a lifetime. And although I no longer needed their apologies to move on, that silent recognition was enough. Because in the end, the worst condemnation someone like my brother can have is not jail or financial ruin, but knowing that when his parents were on the street, when everything collapsed, they did not go looking for him. They knocked on the door of the one they valued least. And that one, the failure, not only opened it for them, but rebuilt everything without forgetting those who left him out from the beginning.